The millionaire made several birthday invitations to send to the classmates of his special son to throw a special party for his boy. The boy was very happy to know he would have a little party. Sometime later, the millionaire found out that no one liked his son and no friends were going to show up. What happens next is unbelievable. The rain beat against the 30th floor window, a persistent drumming that matched the rhythm of Arthur's anxiety. Outside, Park Avenue was a river of blurred lights, cars and umbrellas moving with an urgency that, for the first time in years, he didn't share. His empire, built on the cold logic of numbers and projections, felt like a sandcastle against the tide of guilt rising in his chest. The watch on his wrist, a piece of Swiss engineering worth more than an economy car, read 6 p.m., the end of the workday. For others, a relief. For him, the start of a long night of failure. On his phone screen, the confirmation of what he already knew. 0 replies. Not one of the 30 invitations sent for the birthday party of Leo, his 7-year-old son, had been answered. He had planned it with the precision of a logistics expert, the best children's party venue in Manhattan, a renowned event planner, an entertainer who was practically a celebrity among the city's elite kids. A considerable investment, but money had never been the problem. His fortune, amassed over years of high-stakes trading and early crypto investments, was vast enough to afford any whim. But it couldn't buy friends for his boy. The ride home in his armored German sedan was a blur of traffic lights and reflections. The car, one of his many assets, felt like a capsule of silence, insulating him from the world but trapping him with his thoughts. The windshield wipers, in their back-and-forth motion, seemed to whisper the same word in an infinite loop. Guilt, guilt. How had he not seen it? The pieces were fitting together now, painfully. Leo's smile, once a burst of light that illuminated the house, had been dimming week by week. The school reports were always polished, vague. Leo is adjusting, they said. Adjusting to what? To indifference, to the silent exclusion no security camera could record. He had confused provision with presence, thinking the best private school, the best therapists, and the most expensive toys could fill the absence he himself created, immersed in meetings about capital and dividends. As he parked in the garage of his Upper East Side townhouse, the silence was heavy, foreboding. He took a deep breath, preparing for what he would find. He imagined the empty party room, the colorful balloons already deflated on the floor, a monument to his neglect. He expected to find Leo in his room, quiet, maybe watching one of his favorite music videos, faking a joy he didn't feel. As he turned the key in the massive wooden door, the knot in his stomach tightened. He was a multi-millionaire accustomed to winning, to anticipating market moves, to turning every opportunity into profit. But here, before the door to his own home, he felt emotionally bankrupt. He pushed the door open and, instead of the darkness and silence he had predicted, was met by a soft light coming from the kitchen and a sweet, comforting smell of freshly baked yellow cake. Hesitantly, he followed the aroma. The scene he found paralyzed him. The kitchen, normally a space of stainless steel and minimalist design, was transformed. Garlands of colorful crepe paper, clearly handmade, hung from the ceiling. At the table, a small group of unfamiliar little faces stared at him with curiosity. And there, in the center of it all, was Elena, the nanny, wearing an apron, her eyes shining with unshed tears, holding a simple cake with a single lit candle. Leo, a crooked party hat on his head, was clapping his hands, his face lit by a genuine and overwhelming happiness. Upon seeing Arthur in the doorway, the boy broke into the biggest smile he had given in months and shouted in a voice pure and full of love, "I love you, Mommy. Thank you." The floor seemed to disappear from under Arthur's feet. The title, the gratitude, the love. None of it was for him, and for the first time in a long time, the man who had built a fortress of wealth around himself crumbled, weeping without any attempt to hide it. Arthur's sobs were silent, an internal collapse that manifested in tears he didn't bother to wipe away. The small guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, grew quiet, looking at the large man in the doorway with a mixture of fear and curiosity. It was Elena's voice, soft as the smell of the cake, that broke the spell. "Mr. Albright, it's okay. Please, come in. Leo was waiting for you to cut the cake." She gestured with her head toward the empty seat next to her son. Leo, oblivious to the complexity of his father's emotion, just smiled and patted the chair. "Dad, sit here. We're gonna sing again." Arthur crossed the kitchen, feeling like a stranger in his own home. His eyes met Elena's for a moment, and he saw in them an empathy that completely disarmed him. She wasn't judging him, she understood him, and that, somehow, made it all harder. He sat down, and the world shrank to that kitchen table. The crepe paper garlands seemed more valuable than any piece of art he owned. Later, after the cake was eaten, the improvised gifts, a drawing from the baker's daughter, a wooden car from the doorman's son, were opened with enthusiasm, and the children were taken home by their parents. The quiet settled back in. Leo, exhausted and happy, fell asleep on the living room sofa, clutching a cloth doll Elena had sewn. It was then, in the dim light of the kitchen, that she told him everything. She spoke with her usual discretion, almost apologizing for taking the initiative. She told him how she'd noticed Leo's sadness that morning, a weight on his small shoulders. Instead of letting him sink into melancholy, she took him to the neighborhood bakery. The smell of warm bread and the kindness of the baker, an old Italian man who always saved a pastry for Leo, was the first step. There, they met his daughter, a chatty girl named Sophia. The invitation was spontaneous. "Let's have a party for Leo," she suggested. From there, they went to the building next door, where the doorman's son, little Michael, was playing on the sidewalk. Finally, at the park, two children she always saw with their grandmother. "They don't have much, Mr. Albright, but they have time. And they truly like Leo." The most touching part was when she explained how she taught the other children to sing "Happy Birthday." She had created cards with drawings, a singing mouth, a hand signaling stop, a lung blowing. "Leo likes time," she said. "He needs a pause for each candle. It's his rhythm." His rhythm. Such a simple phrase, but it hit Arthur with the force of a revelation. He had never thought about his son's rhythm. He only tried to fit him into the frantic pace of his own world, a world of deals and high returns. She hesitated a moment before continuing. "I filmed the happy birthday part. It was so beautiful. The baker asked me to because his wife has a lot of questions about Leo's diet due to his allergies. I sent the video just to him so he could show her how happy Leo gets with simple things." Arthur's heart warmed. In that instant, he felt immense gratitude for this woman, whose wealth was not in assets or net worth, but in an emotional intelligence he himself lacked. He was about to say something, to express how grateful he was, when his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from his publicist, an urgent notification. Arthur frowned and opened the link. The screen lit up his face, and the expression of gratitude dissolved, replaced by a mask of ice. There was the video, not in a private conversation, but splashed across a gossip blog under a cruel headline: "Heir's lonely party. Billionaire leaves. Son with Down syndrome to celebrate with the help." The video had been posted by an anonymous profile. Arthur looked up from the screen, the warmth from minutes ago now a cold, cutting fury. He looked at Elena, the woman who had saved his son's day, and the only thing he could see was a traitor. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice heavy with an accusation that hung between them like a sentence. Arthur's accusation hung in the air, dense and venomous. Elena took a step back as if she'd been physically struck. The color drained from her face, and the light in her eyes, which moments before had shone with quiet pride, was instantly extinguished. Her hands, which had shaped the cake and hung the garlands with such care, clenched the fabric of her apron, wrinkling it. She hunched her shoulders, an instinctive gesture, her body retreating into a posture of invisibility she knew all too well. It was her defense mechanism, learned over years of jobs where her presence was tolerated, but never truly seen. She made herself small so as not to be a bother. Arthur, blinded by the protective fury of a father who felt he had failed, saw only her silence as a confirmation of guilt. His mind, trained to identify risk in investments and fluctuations in the stock market, now saw a risk to his family, to his privacy. The online humiliation was a liability he couldn't control. Elena began, her voice a trembling thread that could barely get past the lump in her throat. "I would never do that, sir." With shaking hands, she picked up her modest phone. The screen slightly cracked in the corner. She opened the conversation and held it out to him. At a respectful distance. "See, I only sent it to Mr. Rossi, the baker's father. At 7:14, he replied thanking me. That was it." Arthur's heart pounded. He stared at the small screen. The proof was right there, irrefutable and simple. A single message, a single recipient. His fury, like a fire fed the wrong fuel, suddenly withered, leaving behind only the ashes of a deep and bitter shame. He lifted his eyes from the phone to her face and saw the pain he had caused. The wound wasn't from the accusation itself, but from what it revealed. How quickly he had dismissed her. How easily he had assumed the worst. He, a man whose fortune was managed based on data and analysis, had just convicted her without a shred of evidence. "Elena, the words caught in his throat. Apologizing was not something he did often. In the business world, an apology was an admission of weakness, a loss of capital. But here, in the kitchen, she had turned into a sanctuary of happiness for his son. His arrogance felt pathetic. "I'm sorry. I acted on impulse." She took back her phone, the gesture slow, and gave an almost imperceptible nod. "It's all right, Mr. Albright." But it wasn't all right. The formality in her voice, the mister she used, instantly rebuilt the wall the impromptu party had torn down. The conspiratorial warmth that had united them in Leo's celebration had dissipated, replaced by a professional chill. In her eyes, Arthur no longer saw the woman who understood his son's rhythm. He saw the reflection of the boss who had wounded her, and a terrible doubt began to blossom in Elena's mind. Did he trust her as a person, or did he only value her utility as an employee? The answer seemed painfully clear. She began to clean the kitchen in silence, her movements efficient and quiet. The colorful garlands now seemed to mock the solemnity that had settled in. The house, once filled with the echo of children's laughter, was again immersed in the oppressive quiet of an empty mansion. Arthur remained standing, unsure what to do or say, feeling more helpless than when one of his stocks plummeted on the market. He could command boardrooms, but he didn't know how to fix the trust he had broken with a single sentence. Just then, the shrill ring of his business phone cut through the silence. He glanced at the caller ID, Beatrice Reed, headmistress, Horizon Academy. His stomach turned to ice. He answered, his voice more curt than he intended. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cold, controlled, and sharp as glass. "Mr. Albright, this is Headmistress Reed. I'm calling about the unfortunate exposure of your son on social media. We will need to have a very serious conversation. I require a meeting in my office tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp." The next morning was born grey and damp, a perfect reflection of the atmosphere inside the townhouse. The silence at the breakfast table was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Arthur drank his espresso, staring at market reports on his tablet. But the letters and numbers danced before him without making sense. His real liability wasn't on any of his spreadsheets. It was sitting on the other side of the kitchen island, in the form of broken trust. Elena moved with silent efficiency, preparing Leo's banana pancakes, avoiding his gaze. Her posture was correct. Her tone of voice when speaking to the boy was gentle, but the spontaneity, the spark of joy he had seen the night before, was gone. She was once again the employee, and the house, without her light, seemed just a collection of expensive assets and empty spaces. He left for the meeting with the headmistress feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, a burden no amount of money or fortune could alleviate. While Arthur was facing the corporate world of education, Elena dedicated herself to rebuilding Leo's small universe. She knew the joy of the impromptu party was fragile and that the tension between the adults could easily spill over to the child. To protect the sparkle in the boy's eyes, she took out poster boards and colored markers. With her innate creativity, she drew a sequence of visual cards for the Happy Birthday song. The first card showed an open mouth singing, the second, a flat palm, the universal sign for stop. The third, a drawing of lungs filling with air, and the fourth, a candle being blown out. She sat with Leo on the living room rug, and together they began to practice the choreography of the perfect happy birthday. With each repetition, Leo's laughter echoed through the room, a sound that was the purest form of return on investment that house had ever known. Every pause was respected, every breath was a celebration. It was his rhythm, and there, on that rug, it was the only law that mattered. Arthur returned around lunchtime, his jaw tight, the conversation with Headmistress Reed echoing in his mind. He entered the house expecting the cold silence of the morning, but was greeted by the sound of Leo's laughter. He stopped in the doorway of the living room, unseen. The scene before him was a balm. Leo, standing on a cushion, was conducting the song with the cards, while Elena, sitting on the floor, sang and obeyed his commands with playful solemnity. The pride on the boy's face, his concentration, and his pure, uninhibited happiness were a stark contrast to the rigidity and condescension he had just faced. In that moment, he realized that the greatest investment of his life wasn't in stocks or treasury bonds. It was right there, on that rug, learning to blow out candles in his own time. He cleared his throat, announcing his presence. Elena stood up quickly, her expression turning neutral. "Welcome back, sir." But Leo ran to him, excited. Dad, look, I'm the happy birthday conductor." Arthur knelt and hugged his son, inhaling his scent of childhood and happiness. "I saw Champ. It was the best happy birthday in the world." His eyes met Elena's over Leo's head, and he saw a flash of the woman from the night before. He pointed to a corner of the room he hadn't noticed, where several large cushions, a soft blanket, and a pair of headphones were arranged. "What's that?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Elena hesitated. "It's the hug corner, for when the world gets too loud." Arthur felt a pang in his heart. She thought of everything. His phone vibrated in his pocket, insistent. He pulled it out, his heart sinking when he saw the sender, Horizon Academy. He opened the email. It was the headmistress's official report on the party incident, a cold, bureaucratic summary of their conversation. The last sentence jumped out at him, lodging in his mind like a shard of ice. "After analysis, we have concluded that the low attendance at the event was due to a natural lack of affinity between the student and his peers." Lack of affinity. The two words echoed in Arthur's mind, a cruel euphemism for the exclusion his son suffered daily. He read the sentence again, then a third time, rage bubbling under his skin like lava. The headmistress, with her pedagogical posturing and polished speech, was in fact blaming the victim. She was saying the problem wasn't the environment the school failed to create, but his son's inability to fit in. It was a sentence disguised as a diagnosis, an elegant way of washing her hands of the matter. He felt the primitive urge to call his army of lawyers, to launch a lawsuit that would shake the foundations of that elite institution. His capital could crush them. He could turn Headmistress Reed's zealous reputation to dust. But then he looked at Leo, who was now stacking blocks on the rug, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. A legal battle would mean exposing his son, turning him into a case, a name on a docket. His protective instinct, the same force that had led him to wrongly accuse Elena, now paralyzed him. During dinner, the tension was palpable. Arthur barely touched his food, his mind replaying the conversation with the headmistress. Elena, observant as always, sensed his anguish but maintained the professional distance he himself had imposed. After Leo went to bed, she was cleaning the kitchen when Arthur finally broke the silence. "They say it's his fault," he said, his voice hoarse. He didn't need to explain what he was talking about. Elena stopped what she was doing and turned to him, her eyes conveying a silent understanding. She didn't say, "I told you so," or offer easy solutions. She just waited, seeing his hesitation, his internal struggle between pride and the need for help. She took a cautious initiative. "Mr. Albright, if I may." She went to the small desk where she kept her things and returned with a simple notebook. She opened it on the kitchen counter. Arthur looked at the pages. They were filled with Elena's neat handwriting. They were daily notes. Small observations she had made since she started working there. The first entry read, April 15th. Leo invited his classmate Thomas over to play. His mother said they had a commitment. Further down, April 22nd. He tried to show his new dinosaur to the group at recess. They said it was a baby toy. Page after page, a painful pattern emerged. Ignored invitations, whispered nicknames, the weird one, Crybaby, times when he was the last one picked for teams. It was the chronicle of a forced invisibility, a dossier of small cruelties that, added up, created a mountain of loneliness. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. All of this had happened right under his nose while he was worrying about the dollar exchange rate and treasury yields. Elena turned the page. "This isn't to blame you," she said softly. "It's to understand. The problem isn't a lack of affinity. The problem is a lack of opportunity. Children aren't born with prejudice, they learn it." She then presented her idea, not as an employee giving suggestions, but as someone who cared deeply for the child's well-being. Maybe, instead of a lawsuit, we could try dialogue, propose to the school the creation of peer groups with the help of a specialist, sensory adjustments in group activities like lowering the loud music or creating quiet zones at recess. Simple things that would make all the difference. The proposal was sensible, strategic, and above all, focused on building bridges instead of walls. Arthur felt a wave of admiration for her. Her intelligence wasn't just emotional, it was practical, visionary. He was torn. His combative nature wanted retaliation, but the father in him knew she was right. "Let's try dialogue," he agreed, the decision bringing him a sliver of relief. The next day, he sent the proposal to the school. Headmistress Reed's response arrived in less than an hour. It was even colder than the previous email. "We appreciate the suggestions. We will form a committee to study the student's case after the winter recess." It was an obvious bureaucratic maneuver. She was pushing the problem off, buying time, betting he would give up. That same afternoon, as if the universe were conspiring against his family's peace, the doorbell rang. Arthur opened the door to find an elegant, cold figure from his past, Veronica, his ex-partner and Leo's mother. Veronica entered the house like a blast of Arctic air. She was impeccably dressed in a white linen suit, her blonde hair in a perfect chignon, and she carried an expensive perfume that seemed to fight the familiar smell of yellow cake still lingering in the air. Her icy blue eyes scanned the room, pausing for a moment on the crepe paper garlands with an almost imperceptible sneer of disdain. She didn't see joy. She saw a lack of sophistication. "Arthur, darling," she said, her voice polished but with an edge of steel. I came as soon as I heard about the disaster. Our publicist is having a meltdown. The story of the leaked video is starting to affect brand perception. We need damage control. She spoke of their son as if he were a public relations crisis, a problematic asset to be managed. For Veronica, life was an extension of business, and the family's reputation was her main asset. Leo's emotional well-being was a secondary variable, subordinate to the cash flow of their public image. Elena, who was in the living room putting away Leo's toys, felt the air shift. She straightened up and took a step back, instinctively trying to become invisible, as she always did when she felt threatened. Veronica ignored her completely. Her focus locked on Arthur. "This situation is unsustainable," she continued, gesturing vaguely in Elena's direction. "It's clear this amateur approach isn't working. We need professionals. I've called the Viva Clinic the best in the country. They have an elite residential program, the best specialists, absolute discretion. It's a high investment, of course, but Leo's future and the stability of our legacy are worth any price." Arthur felt a knot in his stomach. Veronica was doing what she always did, applying a corporate solution to a human problem, trying to outsource affection, treating it like a service to be hired. He was about to argue, to defend the small, precious joy he had seen the night before, when a small figure appeared in the doorway. Leo, who was supposed to be in his room, had heard the voices and came to see what was happening. He heard the last part of his mother's sentence, and the name Viva Clinic hung in the air. Leo's smile vanished. His body went rigid, and he took a step back, his large brown eyes wide with panic. He had heard that name before, whispered in tense conversations between his parents. To him, it didn't mean help or elite. It meant being sent away. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not Vivere. Please, no." He ran to Elena and clung to her leg, hiding his face in the fabric of her apron, his small body shaking. It was the first time he had sought her protection in front of Arthur. The gesture was an arrow straight to Arthur's heart, but also to Veronica's pride. It was Elena who spoke first, her voice low but clear and firm, breaking the tense silence. She knelt to be at Leo's level, placing a protective hand on his back. "Mr. Albright, Mrs. Albright, Leo has a right to be heard. He's saying he doesn't want to go." Elena's intervention was the last straw for Arthur. He was being crushed by Veronica's pressure, the school's indifference, his own overwhelming guilt, and now his son's divided loyalty. His businessman's armor, his only known defense, went up again. He looked at Eleanor, not as the woman who had saved his son's birthday, but as the employee who, in his view, was overstepping her bounds. His voice came out cold, sharp, each word a blade meant to wound her where he knew it would hurt most. "Elena, you are confusing your duties." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Elena rose slowly, the spark of courage in her eyes extinguished, replaced by a veil of resigned pain. She gently released Leo's hand and stepped back, her posture returning to professional submission. The warmth, the hope, the fragile bridge of trust they had begun to build. It all crumbled to dust, and the house, for the first time in days, was cold again, a silent mausoleum for an affection that had just been publicly executed. The 2 days that followed were a painful lesson in how a house can have everything and yet be completely empty. Silence was the new tenant in the mansion, an unwanted guest that had settled into every corner. Elena had returned to her duties with robotic precision. Her movements were efficient, her words, when necessary, were monosyllabic. The apron, which on the night of the party had seemed like a superhero's cape, was now just a uniform, an invisible barrier separating her from the family's emotional world. She prepared meals, cleaned the house, cared for Leo, but her soul seemed to have retreated to a safe, inaccessible place. Arthur felt her absence like a phantom limb. Her coldness was a mirror of his own failure. a constant reminder of the cruel words he had used. His pride, however, kept him from apologizing again. Asking for forgiveness once had been an accomplishment. Doing it again would seem like weakness, and he had built his life and fortune on the premise that weakness was the shortest path to ruin. But the true price of his cruelty wasn't paid by him, nor by Elena. It was Leo who absorbed the frost that had settled in the house. The boy, a sensitive barometer of emotional currents, withered. The light in his eyes dimmed, his once easy laughter vanished. He moved through the house like a small shadow, and even his beloved music videos seemed to have lost their color. Arthur, desperate to rekindle his son's joy, resorted to the only method he knew: provision. One afternoon, he came home with a huge box wrapped in shiny paper. Inside was the latest, most sophisticated slot car racing set. An imported piece of engineering that had cost a small fortune. An investment in happiness, he thought. He placed the box on the living room floor. "Look, champ, for you." Leo looked at the toy, at his father, and then looked away. There was no shout of joy, no glimmer of excitement. He just took a step back and shook his head. The boy's silence was more deafening than any scream. That simple gesture demolished Arthur's last defense. All his deals, his assets, his net worth, none of it meant anything if he couldn't buy a single smile from his own son. Arthur's frustration boiled over. He felt powerless, a billionaire reduced to a failed father. His inability to fix the situation manifested as irritation. "Leo, I bought it for you. At least look at it," he said, his voice louder than he intended. It was the trigger. Leo's fragile control shattered. In a fit of anguish he couldn't verbalize, he ran to the coffee table, grabbed the colorful happy birthday cards Elena had made, and with a choked cry began to tear them up, one by one. He ripped the drawing of the singing mouth, the stopping hand, the lungs filling with air. It was an act of symbolic self-destruction, the annihilation of the last happy memory they had shared. Arthur stood frozen, watching the pieces of colored cardstock fall to the rug like funeral confetti. His heart broke. He didn't know what to do. Veronica wasn't there. The experts weren't there. Money couldn't fix this. There was only one person in the house who maybe could. Swallowing his monumental pride, he went to find her. He found her in her room, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking out the window, her suitcase open and half empty on a chair. The sight of the suitcase was a punch to Arthur's gut. He was about to lose her. "Elena," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "I don't know what to do." For the first time, he wasn't the boss, the multi-millionaire. He was just a father, lost and desperate. Elena turned, her face a mask of calm sadness. She looked at him, not with the submission of an employee, but with the clarity of a woman who saw right through his armor. Her eyes held the power to stay or to leave. "He doesn't need another toy, Mr. Albright," she said, her voice low but firm. "He needs the hug corner. And he needs you to sit there with him, without your phone, without your reports, just you, without saying anything. Just be." Elena's words were a map, a guide to a territory Arthur didn't know, that of pure, simple presence. He returned to the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs. The torn pieces of the happy birthday cards were still scattered on the floor, silent witnesses to the small tragedy. Leo was curled up in the corner of the sofa, his face stained with tears, sobs shaking his small body. The slot car set in its shiny box looked like a monument to misunderstanding. Arthur took a deep breath, remembering her instructions. No phone, no reports, just him. He slid his smartphone onto a shelf, the gesture feeling almost ceremonial. Then he walked slowly to the hug corner. The cushions were soft, the blanket inviting. He sat down, his back against the wall, and waited. He said nothing. He didn't call for Leo. He just sat there in silence, occupying the space, being present. They were the longest minutes of his life. Every second was a battle against his impulse to act, to speak, to solve the problem. The business world had taught him that inaction was a luxury that led to lost profits and opportunities. But here, in this room, stillness was the only possible strategy. Leo, between sobs, peeked over the arm of the sofa. He saw his father sitting on the floor, on his cushions, doing nothing. There was a vulnerability in Arthur's posture he had never seen before. The man who ruled an empire of dollars and cents was there, disarmed in his territory. Slowly, like a frightened animal approaching a source of warmth, Leo got off the sofa. He crawled across the rug, bypassing the expensive toy box. He approached the corner, hesitant. Arthur didn't move, didn't speak. He just kept his eyes on his sons, sending a silent message. "I'm here. It's safe." Leo came close, and after a moment that felt like an eternity, curled up next to his father, laying his head in his lap. His small body still trembled, but the sobs began to subside. Arthur, his heart overflowing, raised a trembling hand and began to stroke his son's hair, the gesture slow, rhythmic. And there, in the silence of that room, with the smell of tears and the texture of a little boy's hair, he began to understand the difference between the price of things and their true value. They stayed like that for almost an hour. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, painting golden stripes on the floor. Elena passed the living room door in silence, saw the scene, and her heart leaped. She didn't enter, not wanting to break the moment. The suitcase in her room remained half-packed. Her decision to leave still hung in the air, but now a new variable had been introduced into the equation: hope. Later, when Leo was asleep, exhausted, in his own room, Arthur found Elena in the kitchen. She was making chamomile tea. "Thank you," he said, the word coming out with a sincerity that surprised them both. "I couldn't have done it without you." Elena looked at him, her eyes searching for the truth behind his words. "It wasn't me who did it, mister. Albright, it was you. You listened." The conversation that followed was hesitant but honest. He told her about Veronica's pressure, the school's indifference, his own overwhelming fear of failing his son. She listened without interrupting, her presence a calm anchor in his storm. And for the first time, he asked about her. "Why were you packing?" Eleanor sighed, the steam from the tea misting the air in front of her. "Because I can't work where I'm not trusted. And because it hurts too much to watch someone I admire suffer and not be able to help." Her confession hung between them, delicate and powerful. He wanted to tell her not to go, to stay, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, his practical mind searched for a solution, an action. And then he remembered something one of the mothers at the park had mentioned in passing on the day of the impromptu party. An association, a picnic, a community. "Dear Elena," he said, his eyes lighting up with a sudden idea. "What do you think about a picnic on Saturday?" The idea of the picnic, thrown out like a life raft the night before, transformed the atmosphere of Saturday morning. For the first time in weeks, Arthur didn't wake up with the urge to check the Shanghai stock market or read reports on crypto trends. Instead, his first concern was what to wear. He opened his vast closet, a sanctuary of Italian suits and handmade shoes, and felt like an alien. None of those pieces were suitable for a picnic on the grass. After a moment of hesitation, he chose a pair of jeans he hadn't worn in years and a simple cotton t-shirt. He left his wristwatch, his faithful symbol of status and control, in the drawer. As he came downstairs, he found Eleanor in the kitchen preparing a basket with sandwiches and fruit juice. She looked at him, and a small smile, the first in days, touched her lips. She noticed the absence of the watch, the simplicity of his clothes. It was a small truce, a white flag raised. Her suitcase, he had noticed on his way down the hall was still in the same spot, half-packed, a silent reminder that this peace was conditional. Central Park welcomed them with the smell of damp earth and the distant sound of a horse-drawn carriage. For Arthur, accustomed to the climate-controlled, sterile environments of his business dealings, the place was a sensory explosion. They found the blue picnic easily, a sea of blankets spread on the grass, blue balloons tied to trees, and the soft sound of children's laughter. Arthur immediately felt out of place, a shark in a koi pond. He was surrounded by normal families, by people whose biggest worry that Saturday was whether or not it might rain. He, who managed a fortune of millions, suddenly felt poor in everything that truly mattered. But then he saw Leo, the boy, who had entered the park holding Elena's hand tightly, stopped and looked at the other children. There were boys and girls of all ages, running, playing, just existing without needing to apologize for it. A girl with pigtails and pink glasses waved at him. Leo, hesitant, waved back. The ice broke slowly. First, it was an adapted game of tag, where running was optional and hugging whoever got caught was the main rule. Leo, who never ran for fear of falling, discovered he could participate at his own pace. Then, on one of the blankets, a mother took out containers of Play-Doh. Elena encouraged Leo to join them, and there, sitting between two new friends, under the watchful, amazed gaze of his father, Leo learned to shape the three letters of his name. The L, the E, the O emerged from his hands. Imperfect and colorful, Arthur felt a pride so intense it ached. No return, no dividend, no successful financial investment had ever given him a sense of wealth like that. Later, someone took out a guitar and started playing children's songs. The kids danced, and Arthur, for the first time, didn't feel like an intruder, but like part of something. One of the mothers, a woman with a wide smile named Clara, approached him. "Your son is so happy," she said. "And it's beautiful to see such a present father." And then, as an upbeat song started, Leo pulled Arthur's hand. "Dance, Dad." Arthur hesitated, his fear of looking ridiculous warring with his son's request. He looked at Elena, who gave him an encouraging nod, and he danced, awkward, offbeat, but with a joy he hadn't felt since his own childhood. Clara, the mother, took out her phone. "Can I film this? It's such a pure moment." Arthur, on impulse, agreed. In that instant, he wasn't the billionaire Arthur Albright. He was just Leo's dad. The video, posted with the caption, "A father's greatest investment is his time," was like a spark on dry tinder. In less than an hour, Arthur's phone, which was in his pocket, began to vibrate incessantly with notifications. When he finally looked at it, he saw thousands of shares, of positive comments, but beneath the wave of human warmth, two icy messages appeared almost simultaneously. The first, from his publicist, "Image risk, overexposure can be detrimental, call urgently." The second, from Veronica, was even more cutting. "You let her manipulate you again. It's obvious she planned this whole public display to promote herself." Arthur looked up from the screen, his blood running cold. His gaze met Eleanor's, and Veronica's accusation hung between them, threatening to destroy the fragile bridge they had just built. The ride back from the park was steeped in a heavy silence. Leo, exhausted and happy, had fallen asleep in the back seat, his soft breathing the only thing breaking the tension. The accusations from Veronica and his publicist echoed in Arthur's mind, venomous and corrosive. He glanced at Elena, sitting beside him. Her profile was turned to the window, but he could see the rigidity in her shoulders, the way her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She had felt the shift in the air, the mistrust seeping back in. But this time, something inside Arthur rebelled. He remembered her face when he had wrongly accused her in the kitchen. He remembered the cold that had settled over the house, Leo's suffering. Repeating that mistake was not an option. His growth as a father, as a man, depended on breaking that cycle. As they pulled into the garage, before anyone could get out of the car, he turned off the engine, turned to her and said, his voice firm, "I don't believe them. I believe what I saw today, and I thank you for it." The relief on Elena's face was subtle but profound, like the earth drinking the first rain after a long drought. She gave him a small nod, and the peace, however fragile, was restored. But the seed of doubt had been planted by Veronica, and Arthur, with his strategic mind, knew it wasn't enough to ignore it. It had to be pulled out by the root. That night, after Leo and Elena had gone to bed, he went to his office. The space, normally dedicated to maximizing his financial assets, became a war room for a different kind of battle. He wasn't protecting his capital, he was protecting his heart. For the first time, he used the vast resources of his business for a purely personal end. He made a call to the head of his IT security team, one of the best cybersecurity experts in the country. The order was simple and direct. "I want you to find the origin of the anonymous profile that posted the first video of my son, the one from the birthday party. Spare no expense. I want an answer by tomorrow." It was a matter of protecting his most precious asset, his true legacy, his son's happiness. The next day was one of restrained anxiety. Arthur cancelled his meetings, a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He stayed home, watching the interaction between Elena and Leo from a distance. He saw her helping him glue the pieces of the happy birthday cards back together, turning destruction into an act of creation, a kintsugi of paper. Every gesture of hers was a lesson in patience and resilience. He realized her strength wasn't in passivity, but in a quiet persistence, a silent refusal to let the world's cruelty define her worth. With every passing hour, his conviction that she was innocent solidified. Trust, once a fragile sheet of glass, was being reforged in steel. Finally, late in the afternoon, his personal phone rang. It was his head of security. "We found it, sir." Arthur held his breath. The profile was created, and the post was made from an IP address located at Horizon Academy. Specifically, from a computer in the administration office, we were able to identify the user. Her name is Marissa Oliveira. She is Headmistress Reed's personal assistant. The revelation hit Arthur with the weight of an avalanche. The anger he felt was cold, precise, and absolute. It all made sense. The lack of affinity, excuse. The tactic of delaying the conversation until after the recess. The bureaucratic coldness. It had all been a cover-up. The school, in its eagerness to protect its immaculate image, had not only allowed his son's exclusion, but had actively participated in a campaign to humiliate him, to shift the blame. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and called the headmistress's direct line. Beatrice answered with her falsely sweet voice. "Mr. Albright, what a surprise." Arthur cut her off, his voice low, devoid of any emotion, which made it all the more menacing. "Beatrice, I've just discovered that the profile that leaked the video of my son belongs to your assistant, Marissa Oliveira, and was operated from inside your school. I demand that an internal investigation be opened immediately and that the employee be suspended, and schedule an emergency meeting with the entire school board for tomorrow. The time for studying the case is over." He hung up, his heart pounding. He had just declared war. As he looked up, he saw Elena standing in the office doorway, her eyes wide. She had heard everything. The sound of the phone being hung up was like the starting gun for a race Arthur hadn't known he was running. Elena remained in the office doorway, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with stunned admiration. She had seen the disciplined millionaire and the proud father, but now, for the first time, she saw the relentless protector. He wasn't using his fortune to intimidate, but to demand justice. In that moment, they were no longer boss and employee. They were allies, united by a common purpose, the defense of a 7-year-old boy. The war, however, would have its price. The fallout from his declaration was swift. The first call was from his publicist, his voice shrill with panic. "Arthur, what have you done? You're starting a war with one of the most influential schools in the city. Our clients value discretion, stability. This is a massive risk to your personal brand, a liability we can't control." Arthur listened in silence, and when the man paused for breath, he replied with icy calm, "My only asset that matters right now is sleeping in the room next door. If you can't understand that, maybe our partnership has come to an end." The veiled threat became a fulfilled promise. Hours later, his business phone rang again. It was one of his main clients, the CEO of a European investment fund. The conversation was brief and polite. "Arthur, we heard about a certain disagreement with Horizon Academy. We admire your passion, but our business requires an environment of absolute discretion. We will have to suspend our new contract. We're sorry." Arthur hung up the phone. A 7-figure contract evaporated, a victory that hurt. He looked out his office window at the dark garden. He had lost money, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel poorer. He felt whole. The real victory, however, came from where he least expected it. The next morning, as he and Elena were having coffee in silence, pondering the next move, Leo approached the table. He was holding one of his drawings. "Dad," he said, his voice small but determined, Can we try again? A small party. Just with cake." The request was a mix of courage and hope that broke Arthur's heart. The boy, despite all the wounds, was willing to take a risk again. It was a lesson in resilience that none of his business deals had ever taught him. "Of course, champ," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "We'll have the best mini do-over party in the world." With the school under the pressure of the impending investigation, getting permission to distribute a simple invitation for a gathering with cake and 3 games was surprisingly easy. Elena drew the invitations by hand, small, smiling suns. But Veronica, upon learning of the initiative, worked in the shadows. Wounded in her pride at being ignored, she spread a subtle poison among her circle of influential mothers. "Be careful with that party. I heard the nanny is using the situation to promote herself, maybe to get a job with another wealthy family." The malice, disguised as concern, was effective. Even so, a small miracle happened. 2 of Leo's classmates, whose mothers didn't belong to Veronica's inner circle, confirmed they would come. Hope, fragile and stubborn, bloomed again in the house. On the day of the party, the small table in the living room was set with 4 colorful plates, a simple chocolate cake, and a pitcher of orange juice. Leo, in a new shirt, kept looking at the door, anxiety shining in his eyes. Then the phone rang. It was the first mother. "Something terrible has come up. We won't be able to make it. I am so sorry." 10 minutes later, the second call. The same excuse, almost word for word. The silence that settled in the room was deafening. Elena felt tears burning her eyes, but she held them back. Arthur felt a helpless, overwhelming rage rise within him. Leo looked at the table, at the 4 colorful cups, at the 2 places that would remain empty. His expression of anticipation crumbled, replaced by a painful, silent understanding. He lifted his large eyes to his father, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of all the world's injustice. "Don't they like me?" The father felt the floor give way. Leo's question, so simple and so devastatingly complex, hung in the air, shattering Arthur's heart into 1,000 pieces. In that instant, he understood the true definition of helplessness. All his money, all his influence, all his power in the business world was useless against the pain on his son's face. It was the "all is lost" moment, an abyss of despair that threatened to swallow the small spark of hope they had fought so hard to protect. Arthur's impulse was to break something, to call Veronica and scream, to sue the mothers for emotional distress. But he looked at Leo. who had hunched his shoulders as if expecting a blow, and knew that anger would only make things worse. It was Eleanor who moved first. The tears she'd been holding back glistened in her eyes, but her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. She knelt in front of Leo, ignoring Arthur for a moment, focusing all her energy on the boy. "Leo, look at me." He looked up, hesitant. "Them not coming doesn't mean they don't like you. Sometimes grown-ups get scared of things they don't understand. But you know what? The chocolate cake doesn't care, and neither do we. We like you, and we are going to have the best party in the world anyway." Her words were a balm, but the reality of the empty room was a powerful counterargument. It was then that a plan, born of desperation and creativity, began to form in her mind. She stood up and looked at Arthur, her eyes flashing with a fierce determination. But we can't change what they did, but we can change the venue. We're taking this party to the street." Arthur frowned, not understanding. "To the street?" "Yes," she said, energy returning to her body. "To the sidewalk. We'll take the table, the cake, the cups. We'll call the neighbors, the cotton candy guy who always passes by at this time, the kids from the park we already know. We'll make our own party." It was a crazy, improvised plan, a complete breach of all the security and privacy protocols that governed Arthur's life. But looking at Elena's face, he saw a courage that was contagious. And looking at Leo, he saw a glimmer of curiosity replacing the pain. It was a risk, but the alternative was surrender. "Let's do it," he said, the decision sounding like a battle cry. In 10 minutes, the scene was transformed. Arthur and Elena, in a clumsy but efficient dance, carried the small table and chairs to the wide, tree-lined sidewalk in front of the townhouse. A light drizzle began to fall, mixing the smell of wet pavement with the sweet aroma of chocolate cake. Elena called the doorman of the neighboring building, the bakery. Arthur, not knowing what else to do, felt compelled to contribute. He ran inside and returned with a large patio umbrella, which he opened over the table, creating a small refuge from the rain. Leo, watching everything from the doorway, began to smile. His party hadn't been cancelled, it had been reinvented. Slowly, the magic happened. The baker's daughter appeared, carrying a sweet bread. The doorman's son brought his dog. 2 kids from the park, who saw the commotion, approached with their grandmother. The cotton candy vendor, drawn by the unusual scene, stopped his cart and, at a nod from Arthur, began handing out pink clouds of sugar. Suddenly, the cold sidewalk became an oasis of community, and then a car slowed down. A boy stuck his head out the window. It was one of the classmates who had cancelled, a shy boy named Peter who lived a few blocks away. His mother, at the wheel, had an expression of guilt and hesitation. "We were just passing by," she said, unconvincingly. Elena just smiled. "We're so glad you came. There's still cake." Peter got out of the car, a small gift in his hands, and shyly approached the table. Leo's do-over party now had a guest from school. Arthur, watching this scene of improvised courage, resilience, and sheer stubbornness in celebrating joy, felt an overwhelming clarity. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was also logistics. It was setting up a patio umbrella in the rain. It was knowing who to call when the world turns its back on you. It was turning a disaster into a celebration. And in that moment, he did something that would shift the axis of everything. He took out his phone, opened the class parents group chat, and wrote, "I am inviting everyone to a meeting tomorrow night at my home. The topic is inclusion. And by the way, for anyone nearby, my son's party is happening right now on my sidewalk, and it's amazing." Arthur's message in the parents' group chat landed like a stone in a silent pond, the ripples spreading in every direction. Some replied with thumbs-up emojis, others with a conspicuous silence. But the seed had been planted. That night, at the meeting he had improvised in his home, the atmosphere was tense. About a dozen parents showed up, a mix of the curious, silent supporters and a few from Veronica's circle, likely sent to report back. Arthur, standing in his own living room, felt more exposed than in any shareholder meeting. He had no charts or projections. He only had his truth. At his side, slightly behind him, stood Elena, her presence a source of quiet strength. He had spoken with her beforehand, asking her to participate, not as an employee, but as a partner. He began to speak, his voice steady, devoid of the corporate arrogance that usually characterized him. He told his story, his journey from an absent father who confused provision with presence. He spoke of his son's pain, the beauty of the impromptu party, the cruelty of exclusion. And then he made his masterstroke, his final move. I've realized the fault isn't just with the school or a few parents. The fault is also mine for staying silent for so long, he said, his honesty disarming the room. But that ends today. My son matters more than any contract I could lose. His happiness is my greatest asset. And so, tonight, I'm announcing the creation of an inclusion program fully funded by my company for the entire school community. A murmur went through the room. He continued, this program will fund teacher training, the hiring of recess mediators, the adaptation of materials, and the creation of regular peer groups, and I will not be the one leading it. He turned and extended a hand toward Elena. It will be co-led by the Central Park Families Association and by this woman, Elena, who has taught me more about humanity and courage in 5 weeks than I've learned in 40 years. Elena's jaw dropped. He hadn't told her that part. Her gaze met his, and she saw gratitude, respect, and something more. Something that made her heart race. Headmistress Reed, who had been all but forced to attend, turned pale. Cornered by Arthur's initiative and the pressure from the parents present, she had no choice but to publicly accept the partnership and the immediate implementation of the peer groups. Veronica, informed of the speech by one of her allies, realized she had lost the war. Her poison had been neutralized by vulnerability and action. She didn't show, exiting the stage, burned by her own malice. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. The 5th week began with a visible transformation. At Leo's school, the harsh fluorescent lighting in his classroom, which bothered him, was replaced with softer lights. Trained monitors began organizing inclusive games at recess. Elena's hug corner was replicated in a larger version in the school library. The changes were small, but their effects were monumental. One afternoon, one of the mothers who had cancelled the party approached Leo at dismissal. She knelt down and, with teary eyes, apologized. "Adipita missed you so much," she said. "Can we try for a playdate next week?" Leo, with his infinite capacity for forgiveness, just smiled and nodded. At home, the dynamic between Arthur and Elena also transformed. He started coming home earlier, not out of obligation, but out of desire. He wanted to see Leo, wanted to talk with Elena about the program's progress. His hobby of photographing expensive cars was replaced by a new focus. He now photographed Leo's hands, sticky with frosting, his spontaneous hugs, his blossoming smile. Elena, in turn, felt herself flourishing. In the program meetings, she asked to be called by her name, not the employee. Her voice, once hesitant, grew firmer each day. They still maintained a careful distance. A romance lingered in the air, thick and sweet like the smell of brownies, but both hesitated to take the final step. There was his fear of mixing his personal and professional life, her fear that confessing her feelings could somehow cost her the job and stability she prized. But the biggest obstacle of all had already been overcome: the silence. They talked, they laughed, they shared knowing glances when Leo said something funny. They were building a foundation, brick by brick, based on mutual respect and admiration. The house, once a cold and impersonal space, was becoming a home. and they both knew the true resolution to their own stories was about to happen. Saturday was born with a sky so blue it felt like a promise. The townhouse, once a sanctuary of silence and minimalist design, was overflowing with life. The smell of brownies baking in the oven mixed with the savory scent of mini quiches, creating the unmistakable aroma of home. In the living room, children from school and children from the park mingled on the foam mat, building block towers and laughing at jokes only they understood. The music was low, a soft acoustic playlist that allowed for conversation. Arthur watched the scene from the doorway, his heart full. He thought of all the wealth he had accumulated, the assets, the properties, his enviable cash flow, and he realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to this. This scene was his true net worth, the only investment that really mattered. Elena moved among the children with a natural grace, her presence a calm force organizing the chaos. Her eyes met Arthur's over the children's heads, and they shared a smile, a silent communication that held weeks of battles and fears and victories. It was time for the cake. It was a replica of the yellow cake from the first party, only bigger, with colorful candles forming the number 7. The children gathered around the table, their faces lit with anticipation. They sang "Happy Birthday" to Leo's rhythm, with the long, solemn pauses he loved so much. At the end of the song, before the breath could extinguish the flames, Leo did something unexpected. He reached out his small hands and took Arthur's right hand and Elena's left, joining them together. The silence that fell over the room was electric, palpable. The boy looked first at Elena, his big eyes shining with a pure, unshakable truth, and then, his voice perfectly clear for everyone to hear, he said, "I love you, Mommy." The word, loaded with all the innocence and certainty of a child, hung in the air, changing everything forever. Arthur's world collapsed and rebuilt itself in that second. The tears he had held back for so long came, hot and liberating, and for the first time he cried without hiding, without shame. A father being baptized in his son's love. Elena cried too, but her tears were different. They were a wet smile, a smile she didn't know she possessed, the blossoming of a woman who was finally allowing herself to be chosen, to be loved. Later, when the last child had gone home and Leo was asleep, exhausted and happy, Arthur and Elena were alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the sweet mess of the party. He turned to her, his expression serious but his eyes soft. He didn't offer her a fairy tale, didn't promise a life without hardship. He offered her the only thing that truly mattered, his presence. In a steady voice, he said, "What happened today? This is what I want for my life. I want to build a real home, a place where Leo's rhythm is our rule, a place that smells like cake and has laughter on the rug." He paused, his heart laid bare. "And I can't do it alone. I wanted to ask if you would be willing to walk with me slowly at the same pace." She looked at him, at the man who had learned to shed his armor, and the answer was already in her eyes. She accepted, not as a prize for her suffering, but as a mutual choice, a partnership of souls who had found each other at the right rhythm. The cold townhouse permanently smelled of cake in the evenings. On Sundays, the garden hosted the Happy Birthday workshop for new families. The inclusion program at the school became a benchmark. Every victory had required a sacrifice, a lost contract, public apologies, a bruised ego, but the poetic justice made it all worthwhile. Here was a family born from a simple cake, a spontaneous "I love you," and two people who learned that loving, above all, is about adjusting the tempo of your own heart to finally hear the one who always deserved to be heard.